Thank you for being here. My name is Phil Stein. I'm a partner in the litigation department here at Bills & Sundberg. I also am the leader of our financial services team and our burgeoning data security and privacy team that's getting very busy as a reflection of what all of you are experiencing as you get busier and busier having to deal with these kinds of issues. The title of this program is Challenges of Data Security and Privacy. And I guess a place to start is that there are, of course, so many challenges that need to be dealt with. If this were an area of business and the law where all we really needed to focus on was hiring a really good IT team and keeping them in place, this would be a very short program and you probably wouldn't have been interested in coming to hear us deliver the program. Likewise, if the legal and business consequences of data breaches and loss of privacy were narrow or limited, and if the liability that one could suffer was not severe for those kinds of breaches and violations, again, it wouldn't be that meaningful a program. But the sad truth is that the array of challenges is very significant. The depth and breadth of the kinds of problems, the kinds of things that we need to be focused on are very significant. As a lawyer at a law firm, obviously we're very focused on all the legal ramifications and implications of data security and privacy issues. And some of them may already be somewhat apparent to you. I'm guessing some of them are not in terms of the way these problems manifest themselves. We've all heard, I think, about major consumer class actions and major data breaches that have given rise to those consumer class actions. Ashley Madison, Home Depot, Target, some others that you may have heard of. And that's a very significant part, of course, of the array of examples of bad consequences from data breaches. But think about all the other ways, just from a legal perspective, that data security issues kind of rear their ugly heads. There's the issue of cyber liability insurance, an increasingly important issue. Procuring it and then, if necessary, fighting over what is and what is not covered under your policy. Protecting trade secrets and sensitive employee data or sensitive client data. Fiduciary duties of officers and directors with respect to having the right kind of processes, procedures, protocols in place at their companies to ensure that they really are doing what they need to do to put their companies in the best possible perspective. On the flip side of fiduciary duties of officers and directors, what about director and officer liability issues and shareholder suits and corporate governance disputes that arise when arguably officers and directors haven't done everything they could do to ensure that the right programs, the right systems are in place to keep data secure and sensitive? What about on the plaintiff side? It's not just class action attorneys, plaintiffs attorneys who are focused on data security and privacy breaches. Being vigilant about your company's data that's housed with other companies so that you can take legal action, even on the plaintiff side if necessary, to remedy a problem that has been caused by some other company or experienced by some other company. Being vigilant about taking all available actions when hacking or data breaches either at your company or on some other company's systems cost you money or disrupt your systems or your business. And that's all just kind of thinking of things largely from a civil perspective. There's also, of course, criminal liability. There's also the regulatory side, complying with a true kind of alphabet soup of regulations from various governmental agencies and departments. One of the things that I like about the panel that we've assembled today and that I think we'll all benefit from is that broad range of challenges is kind of reflected in the broad range of perspectives that are represented by the members of this panel. They've got a broad range of perspectives by virtue of, among other things, the very different types of positions that they hold. You'll be hearing from George Ray, who's the Director of Information Security and Compliance at Kaufman Rossen. You'll be hearing from Mark Stone from the business world, who is a general counsel at a major company, at TradeStation. Jared Strauss, who is an assistant U.S. attorney, can give you the government and prosecutorial perspective on things. In addition to being an assistant U.S. attorney here in the Southern District of Florida, he is, in that capacity, the computer hacking and intellectual property coordinator for the Southern District. And my colleague, Jay Ward, in the litigation department here, who has, in a relatively short amount of time, really built up quite a level of recognized expertise in the data security and privacy world, doing a lot of work in that area and becoming kind of a recognized authority nationally with respect to these issues, as reflected in the number of articles that he's written and the number of media appearances that he's made. So I think we'll all benefit from their perspectives. After they make some presentations to you, I'm going to have some questions for them. I certainly encourage you, rather than me asking the questions, to jump in with the questions, the concerns that brought you here today, and we'll make sure that we get as many of those asked and answered as possible. I'm going to say this again at the end of the presentation, but while we don't want any of your personally identifiable information, we do invite you to, at the end of the program, if you want to, make use of the laptops that we've got right outside the conference room here. We're asking that you participate, if you haven't already, in a data security assessment survey that would just, I think, help us, maybe help all of us going forward in understanding a little bit better what the challenges are that you see at your companies and what some of your perceptions are about the issues that we're talking about today. So let me turn it over to George Ray to get things started.
Good morning, everyone. George Ray with Kaufman Rossen, one of the largest CPA firms in South Florida. In addition to being a consulting company, I lead our information security practice, and I've performed over 100 security engagements across different industries. So I wanted to talk about something that a lot of companies are not doing. We all have firewalls, but one of the biggest issues we have is phishing. We are not training our employees properly, okay? The reason why a lot of companies are getting hacked is because phishing or spear phishing. So there's been some research and reports out there that out of a phishing attack that's being sent, 30% of those emails will be open, and 12% of those emails will be clicked. That's the beginning of a hacking incident. So why is this? Why 12% or why 30%? It's pretty much very simple. Phishing looks very real. And I don't know if you guys have gone through the process, or I'm sure one of you guys have received a letter from Nigeria asking you to send some money. There's others that are a little more sophisticated. They really make you believe that you're part of your bank or part of your account with any of the major social networks, but phishing is real. And it's very difficult to identify, it's very difficult to track, and it's one of our biggest weaknesses as a company. So how can you prevent it, or how can you identify it? Typically, phishing has some elements that you want to be looking at, and you can identify that through different situations. Kind of like, is it generic? Sometimes they have your email or not. It always requires you to do something very fast, very immediately, and if you don't do it, then something wrong is going to happen to you. So they're actually dealing with your emotions when they're sending you an email saying, hey, it looks your account has been hacked. You have to click here to reset the password. There you go. So you just heard that LinkedIn got hacked, and you got to reset password, and you're doing it. Your account could have been compromised at that moment. So when we do, based on our experience, and as we've actually heavily focused on helping companies train information security, but primarily on phishing, we've seen that typically when our clients go through one of our Hack Me campaigns, 30% of the phishing will be open, and pretty much 14 to 15% of the targets will click the emails. So if we're not training our employees, and I think that's a question for you guys, if you're not training your employees on phishing, spear phishing, you're at risk.
That's it.
That's it.
How about Mark Stone? Let's hear from Mark.
Okay, so I'm Chief Legal Officer at TradeStation Group. It was a public company from 97 to 2011. 2011, it was purchased by one of the largest online brokerages in Japan, in Tokyo, listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So I've been doing this almost 20 years, and my responsibilities now include general oversight of all legal, compliance, risk management, and internal control, even though I am not an accountant. But that is something I'm overall responsible for at a high level. So the business of TradeStation, it's an online stock brokerage. It's the 7th largest in the country based on customer volume. If you go over all the big names you know, we're kind of next. And everything about the business is electronic. First of all, it covers stocks, options, and futures. But based on the company's business model, it is directly connected electronically to every stock, futures, and options exchange in the U.S. So the server farms have, directly from the exchanges, all the data coming in to the clients, the customers, the self-directed traders, and all of their order placement and execution going out. And it's 20, 30 exchanges throughout the U.S. and Europe. Everything about the business is electronic, almost 100%, which gets me to how I look at this as cybersecurity. I look at it broader from a business. I mean, if you look at the definition of an information system, a set of activities involving people, processes, data, technology, which enable the organization to obtain, generate, use, and communicate transactions and information to maintain accountability and measure and review the entity's performance or progress towards achievement of objectives. That's the 2013 COSO internal control integrated framework definition, which almost everyone goes by now. So when you think about that, for all financial services firms and for almost all goods and services business, information systems are at the core of the entire business, both from the product delivery and marketing and the internal infrastructure from which you have to run the business. I want to go to the next one. Just to give a little bit more on this, which I think this is kind of a bigger issue than just cybersecurity and goes to the concepts of enterprise risk management, internal control, why you really have to take a very holistic firm culture approach to this and not looking at as what applications do I get from which consultant to protect against cybersecurity. I don't think it works that way because, I mean, everything about almost every business today, and obviously more for financial services businesses and internet-based and web-based businesses, your financial records, how you monitor your transactions, analyze them, store them, retrieval, how you do your business intelligence so you make decisions about whether you doing things right or wrong. All of your compliance, not only do you have to monitor things in real time electronically for compliance, but the very way you report to your regulators is over the internet. No one's accepting paper reports anymore. The regulators really aren't doing that. The products themselves are intangible. In my business, if there's stocks, bonds, mutual funds, 401ks, financial accounts, software apps, cloud services, devices, websites, the very products themselves exist in space and can be accessed. How you do the inventory, even if you have hard assets, your inventory is being monitored electronically and accessible. Marketing, human resources, all your employees' personal information, all the internal communications. I mean, how many of us have seen the email chains that just want to make us blow our brains out as they get longer and longer and never stop, and people say things that make you go like that and roll your eyes. Customer relationships, service, and support. Everything is electronic, your intellectual property, how you maintain it, how you protect it. And then anything that's paper for backup, well, that gets archived, right, and is electronic also. So it's really almost 100% of infrastructure of businesses, and if not the product itself, things surrounding the product. So when I look at it, I do think you need a top-down approach, and every regulator pretty much today, whether you're a public company or want to be a public company, whether you just want to raise private equity and go through that kind of due diligence, and whoever you're regulated by, everyone is moving in the same direction. You have to look at enterprise risk management in a certain way, generally through the COSO framework, which is what everyone is moving to today. You want it integrated, and depending on your size, you have to think about various kinds of resources, whether to have a chief risk officer, whether to have a vice president of internal audit internally, all of those kind of things. And I guess one other point I'll get to, because I'm probably going over my time, is when I look at this, as cybersecurity people always think fraud, and certainly there is fraud. There's fraud, as discussed, there's phishing, there's hacking, there's people trying to impersonate customers. There's bad customers themselves, depending on who you do business with, which is another thing you have to think about. But there's also negligence and incompetence. So to me, fraud is only half the issue, and it's the more concrete issue. The real issue, and this is what enterprise risk management and internal control is about, and we can talk more about it in Q&A if there's time, but the real thing about internal control is it helps prevent the same kind of mistakes that just have as bad a result as a fraud. You'll have the same bad results if, for example, you don't do change management properly when you do a modification to a server. Let's say quality assurance has said, I did a server just about exactly like it, so we made the same exact change, it looks good, and then it goes in, but one thing was different, everything happened the opposite, and clients went under $100 million. You still have to cover the cost the same if it was a fraud. You still have the reputational consequences for it happening when it gets into the news. So to me, there's very little difference between fraud and negligence in terms of how you deal with your information systems. And that's how I would urge people look at it and getting together the approach, business culture from the top down, which means that every initial meeting of a new business project, you're there with your chief risk officer, your compliance. You don't bring them in 2 weeks later. You start at the outset thinking about that as one of the 10 things on the list to think about for the project. And that's how you have to kind of start thinking. And in the end, believe it or not, even though the resources are a lot of money, it will save you more money and give you more efficiency in the long run. So I'll just stop it there for now.
Before we hand it off to Jared Strauss, just wanted to add, in connection with Mark's very, very savvy comments, that obviously there are all sorts of different types and sizes of companies, and in dealing with some larger companies, one of the things that's becoming more and more apparent is that there really is an expectation on the part of plaintiffs' attorneys that I guess needs to be responded to, and also to some extent regulators, to a significant extent regulators, that larger companies, the ones that have boards of directors and layers of top officers and managers, there's an expectation that they are going to be not only engaging in best practices, but there should be a paper trail of those best practices. If there are minutes, as there should be, of board of director meetings, we'd love to see, if we're representing you, that over time you have, as a company, in your board meetings, and as reflected in the minutes, spent time discussing data security practices and protocols and the procedures and systems that you have in place. That you're not only that you have a chief compliance officer who's very much focused on data security and privacy issues, but that maybe somebody from the outside is kind of auditing what the chief compliance officer and the compliance team are doing. So there are all sorts of things that I think, as we get more and more into a world in which digital security and privacy are so important, more and more that I think needs to not only be happening, but needs to be reflected on paper or digitally as having happened. So with that being said, sorry for the interruption there, Jared, but Jared Strauss is our next speaker.
Thanks. So I'm Jared Strauss. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you. I've been with the Department of Justice, both in D.C. and down here, for now about 10 years, almost all of it, at least partially involved in computer crime. So I have some sense of the broad range of issues here, and also a sense of both what government can and cannot do to help all of you in the private sector. And I can't pretend like we have solutions to everything or can prosecute our way out of cybercrime entirely. One thing I do want to talk about, a couple of things, some on the what you can do to trends that you can try to protect yourself from, and then a couple of other threats that that are potentially more likely to lead to a prosecutable case, and what sort of things go into working with law enforcement to potentially prosecute people who have harmed you and your company. First few things are some trends that we've seen, that this follows onto what Jorge was talking about. We've seen a large growth recently over the last couple of years in both business email compromise and ransomware scams that are typically delivered, as Jorge was talking about, through phishing. These are scams that are particularly important for you to know about because they are, I think, relatively easy to execute, and require not just the technological solution, but as Jorge was talking about, an educated employee solution. Business email compromise, if you don't know, is phishing emails that aren't so much the dear customer or dear anonymous person, but things that are really targeted to your business, either impersonating one of your customers, impersonating an officer at your company, something that is very targeted to its recipient to try to either trick them into downloading some sort of malware that will enable money to get transferred out of your organization, or just even to trick, someone who controls finances within your company in making a transaction. For instance, you might get an email that appears to be from one of your customers, maybe a financial client, maybe even appearing to come from the CEO of the business saying, hey, this money needs to get transferred here immediately for whatever purpose. It's a relatively simple scam, but it's affecting more and more people every day, and as you can see, more than $2 billion since 2013 has left the United States economy and gone overseas because of these types of scams. The two things that you can do to help insulate yourself a little bit from these kind of scams are, one, the awareness that Jorge was talking about, having employees who are savvy enough to spot a phishing email, to have a sense of when a request is coming in that might not be exactly correct. The other is two-factor authentication. For any sort of large financial transaction, getting an email shouldn't be enough. Actually having phone contact with that executive who so urgently wants the money transferred, or with that client who wants to be changing their account, can be crucial and can really short-circuit the process for the scammers. Ransomware, I hope everyone is aware of. This is, frankly, to be honest, not something that we can prosecute very easily. It's a very difficult problem to deal with, but it's something that is affecting more and more people and individuals every day. That's, again, usually through a phishing email, the delivery of a kind of malware that locks down your system, encrypts everything, and then you get a message saying, hey, you want your information back, you can pay us a ransom and we'll decrypt it for you, or you cannot pay us and everything you have is gone. This is affecting businesses, it's affecting schools, hospitals, even government offices and police departments. Again, the only answer to this is to be savvy, to be aware of it, and to make sure that you have backup systems in place so that when your files are encrypted, you can more easily say, that's gone, let's go back to the backup, rather than having to decide, are we going to pay, a couple $1,000s in Bitcoin to these anonymous scammers. In addition to those sort of scams, we continue to see a whole host of different cyber threats out there that I probably don't have to remind you of. This can be everything from insiders within your organizations, people taking either trade secrets, customer lists, other important data from the inside, to the more outside persistent threats that that Phil was alluding to before, the things that lead to an Ashley Madison or a Target or a Home Depot sort of attack. Those attacks can come from anywhere. We're seeing increasingly attacks that come through other organizations that you're partnering with, say contractors that have, or your HVAC system, your clients that can submit invoices through an online system. There are all manner of different vectors that are used to get into your network and cause some real mischief. In addition to making you aware of what sort of threats are out there, I want to make a pitch that law enforcement does have a role to play here, and that we can work with you to help address some of the threats that we're facing. We have both capabilities of our traditional prosecution remedies, trying to identify, apprehend, and prosecute bad actors. But we also have other roles that we can play as well in terms of intelligence gathering and sharing, and also using non-prosecution tools to help deter people that we might not otherwise be able to get our hands on. I'd like to go over just a couple of the things that can make the difference between a prosecutable case and an investigation that goes nowhere. One is that speed is key for us, especially in a world where a lot of the evidence is digital, can be easily destroyed, where we have to kind of unravel several layers of anonymity. Getting a head start is really important. And so learning about a breach close in time to when it happens versus waiting 6 months can be the difference between being able to solve it and not. Making available the kind of information that we need to do an investigation, the systems logs that are essentially the crime scene for all intents and purposes for a breach, the technical personnel that understand your networks and can explain to us, help us understand what we're seeing when we look at those logs, and the forensic reports that you privately have done for your own internal investigation can really give us a head start in trying to identify and prosecute someone. But of course, the main thing that's not a bullet point up here is that we catch 0% of we solve 0% of the crimes that we don't know about. If a breach isn't reported to us, if an incident's not reported to us, there's obviously nothing that we can do. I know there are a couple of different concerns that often lead businesses to say, I don't want to get law enforcement involved. I'd rather just try to make this go away on my own. There are concerns about confidentiality, concerns about, well, gee, if I call the FBI, the civil regulators are going to be the next ones knocking at my door. I have civil remedies. I don't want to get gummed up. And these are all legitimate concerns, but they're concerns that we can work with you to address. And I think they're concerns that should not ultimately prevent a prosecution from happening and prevent you from reporting. I'm happy to talk about how we can address these concerns more in the Q&A. Finally, I gave Nicole a list of contacts for you to consider that are outside. They have contact information for the local FBI and Secret Service Miami field offices, as well as my office, both me and other people in our office, that can be your primary contacts when a cyber incident occurs. There are also contact information for a number of public and private information sharing networks that can really help you build up your expertise, find out what the latest threats are, and learn to protect yourself.
Go ahead, Jay.
Morning.
Clean up.
Good morning. I'm Jay Ward from Bills and Sundberg, and I'm glad to be here with you this morning to talk about issues that I know are top of mind for clients and are at the forefront of what we're thinking about in our practice group here. At the beginning of the seminar this morning, Phil said that he wanted to talk about perspective, and I think that's right. And what we want to do today is maybe challenge the perspective that you have on data security, information management, and privacy, and shift your perspective and how you look at those issues. And I think one way to consider data security and managing the information you have is to remember the story of the two men on safari who stumble on a sleeping cheetah and wake it up. And they know that one of them, or both of them, is about to get eaten. And one of the guys starts putting on his running shoes. And the other says, what, you think you're going to outrun a cheetah? And he says, I don't have to outrun the cheetah. I just have to outrun you. That's the way data security works. Most cyber criminals, most hackers are going after soft targets. And the reason they're going after soft targets is that they know that they're out there. If you look at the spectrum of cases and the spectrum of hacks that you've heard about in the last 5 to 10 years, the vast majority of them involve some form of bad data hygiene. People aren't changing passwords. People's passwords aren't strong enough. The password is password. There's any number of things that people are doing that leave themselves open to risk. And the statistics are pretty conclusive that one of the common ways that a cyber criminal comes after you, your business, or your information is the brute force method. They try to get into your servers by trying 1,000 passwords a second. And the more you can do to strengthen those access points, to take advantage of those access points, having protection, the less likely you are to be the target. They'll move on to someone else. So you don't have to have a perfect data security or information management system. None of us are saying that because there is no such thing. But what we are saying is this is an arbitrage opportunity. Find a way to be just a little bit better, a little bit quicker, a little bit smarter than the competition, and you can protect the information that you have. The information you have, your brand, that is your currency. So taking steps on the front end to shore up your information management systems will help you in the long run, and that's both a business and a legal perspective. You know, we're talking about passwords. One of the things that most people suffer from when they're trying to come up with a password that's secure enough to keep them from getting in trouble is, how do I come up with something extremely convoluted that no one will ever think of? I'll replace a 0 with with an O, or I'll, instead of an A, I'll use the number 4. I got news for you. Computers think of all of those things, and it's the computers that the hackers are using that's trying to get into your servers. So in the time that it takes you to peck out the underscore and write hard code in leet speak with 4s and 0s, I wrote in, I ate cafecito and pastelitos this morning. That's my password. It'll take somewhere between 30 and 500 years for a computer making 1,000 attempts a second to break my password. Your password will be broken in 3 days. So I hear all the time from clients, well, I'm concerned about how long it's going to take to have these really strong passwords. Well, if you understand what a strong password is, if you have the right perspective on what it means to shore up your security, you'll recognize, number one, that the amount of time you spend hitting that underscore, because no one likes to use an underscore, takes much more than it does to just write out your breakfast. You've already memorized what my password is when I just told you, and I challenge you to write down in the same amount of time what your present password is. Please don't write down what your password is on a piece of paper. And the third point is, someone in a deposition one day will say to you, why didn't you have stronger passwords? Well, it took a long time to write them out. The extra 5 seconds to write out the strong password was just too much. And the opposing counsel will say, and the breach of your company's data that harmed my client wasn't? Thinking about data security from that perspective, from the arbitrage perspective, from the taking steps on the front end to secure yourself on the back, that's the perspective that we encourage our clients to have, because that's the perspective that protects your business and keeps you from being on the other side of the table from Mr. Strauss or from the other side of the table from your clients. So the title of the presentation that I have is Data Security and Privacy Issues, Teaching Clients to be DataSmart, and I used a hashtag so you know I know what I'm talking about. My view on PowerPoint presentations is much the same as my view on cinnamon rolls. The first 3 are great, but by the 4th you start to regret your life choices. So I'm not going to show you every slide here. It's available to you, and it's important, I think, to think about the issues that are in here, but we don't need to talk in great detail about every one of them. First thing to remember, privacy and data security aren't the same thing. Data security is, we'll start with privacy. Privacy law is about what you do with the data that is in your possession. So are there obligations that you have to keep data private? Yes, there are. And dependent upon your industry, it may be a federal regulation, it may be an industry regulation. If you're in the medical services field, there's HIPAA to consider. There are a number of statutes that govern what the privacy of the information you have is. So we think about the laws like HIPAA or the FERPA, the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. All number of federal and state laws govern the privacy of your customers or your clients' information. But data security is different. Data security is about protecting your information and your client's information from what someone else is going to do with it. Data security is about shoring up your protective measures so that someone else doesn't come in and take your information, which is, as we've said, is your currency. That's your brand. Or taking your client's information, which is quite literally their personhood, their brand. So the laws that are issued by the states and the federal government, like the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, aim at what your businesses are going to do, how you obtain the information, whether you're getting it lawfully, and when you can share it. And that's why you treat privacy like corporate compliance. You think about how to make sure you're complying with FERPA or COPA or the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 or state regs. You sit with your compliance officers, as Mark said, and you talk about, when you're beginning a project, what are we doing to make sure that we're not running afoul of these regulations? Because the cold facts of thinking through how we're going to be compliant are much easier to handle than the hot facts of a phone call from a regulator. So privacy doesn't mean secrecy. That's another important point I want to make to you. Secrecy is a social construct. Secrecy is you've told me something and I can choose whether or not to share that with someone else. So don't confuse privacy with secrecy. There is no right to secrecy. There are sometimes rights to privacy, and there are always regulations about disclosing information that you're not allowed to. But secrecy is something that we sometimes hear thrown around in conversations about information management. And it's not a helpful term, because legally it doesn't mean anything. And in terms of data security, something that's secret is something that you've written down in a hard copy piece of paper and put under your bed. That's about the only thing that you can make sure is secret when it comes to electronic information management. And here's the key to remember, that data security is not privacy, it's consumer law. When we're talking in the mine run of cases, what data security means to you, it is how you are protecting the information that your consumers, your customers, your clients give to you. Because in every transaction you have with your clients, they're entrusting you with their PII, their personally identifiable information, and their PFI, their personal financial information. Every time they swipe a credit card, every time they enter an order online, every time they call you and disclose personal information. And it might just be on the phone asking them to give you their address. That's all information that's protected. Customers are the darlings of consumer law, and customers are entitled to a high degree of confidence in what you intend to do and what you will do to safeguard their information. And this is where the large spike in regulatory actions and lawsuits in the information management world has come from. This is where your Home Depot hack comes in. This is where your Target hack comes in. This is where hopefully not your Ashley Madison hack comes in. All of these things are really consumer law because it's people who trusted a business to safeguard their information and the business failed. So we don't need to go through this slide. It's very small text. You can read it online. Federal and state consumer laws govern the security of customer data. And if anyone has staked out a claim in this area, it is the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission has really begun to exercise a wide range of authority over these consumer data security breaches. They investigate, they sanction, they sometimes engage in litigation, and we'll talk about some of those. And the reason that's important is because understanding how the Federal Trade Commission views these cases and what they consider to be an important issue, a serious breach, something that was just a mistake that couldn't be helped, understanding how the FTC looks at those issues will help you understand what you need to do on the front end to protect your business. Because if you look at how the FTC's enforcement actions have gone over the last 10 years or so, it's almost like a blueprint for what the Commission considers to be adequate and inadequate protection of consumer data. So data security's ABCs are the difference between an attack, which virtually every business suffers. Your businesses right now may well be under attack. B is breach. Has the hacker gotten into your system? Has your server been compromised? And then that's the C, the compromise. Because you can be breached, but maybe nothing's happened. It happens sometimes. There are hackers who just want to see if they can get into your system, and then that's it. And if that's all that happens, you consider yourself fortunate. The likely outcome of a breach, though, is a compromise. And that means your information is now readable or exploitable by a third party. Jared was talking about ransomware. I mean, this is nasty stuff. They can get into your servers and they will lock your system down. It's happened to hospitals. It's happened to schools. It happens to businesses. And what the studies indicate is that the majority of ransomware attacks that lock businesses out of their servers are paid off and are never reported to the government. In fact, there are some studies that indicate that most cyber attacks, most breaches, most compromises are not reported. They are paid off or they're swept under the rug and people try to move on. And I want to encourage you to avoid that strategy. Because if it emerges later that you were breached and you knew and you didn't resolve the problem, that's when you get an enforcement letter from the FTC. So I want to point out one case which I think is extremely illustrative, and that's the FTC versus Wyndham case. Wyndham Hotels is a worldwide brand of Wyndham managed and Wyndham franchised properties. And like most hotels and hotel chains, Wyndham has been the subject of repeated attacks. Hotels in the hospitality industry are one of those soft targets that I was talking to you about before. Why? A transient group of clients, many points of access for information. You've got the card swipe at the hotel gift shop, you've got the card swipe at the front desk, you've got the card swipe at the bar, you've got the card swipe at the valet. Each one of those places are access points for potential hacks. You have people logging on to what may not be a particularly secure Wi-Fi server in their hotel rooms. You have people at the hotel who, once they're logged in, some of them have a password, that's password. Now, in this case, unfortunately, it was Wyndham who had password as the password. Access to Wyndham's worldwide management system was admin, which is the default password when you buy a system. It was never changed. And even then, after the first hack, after they were aware that there was a problem, Wyndham didn't do anything. There was another hack, more credit card information stolen. They didn't do anything. They didn't change the passwords. They didn't take steps to protect their customer data. After the third, and in some ways most comprehensive breach, the FTC got involved. And it's because the FTC saw a pattern of failure to act that this was a case that was brought in litigation and not just a letter that said, you've made some mistakes, here's what we're going to do to fix this. This went to the district court in the District of New Jersey. Wyndham fought it, and Wyndham said, you have no jurisdiction here. This is not a consumer issue. This is not an unfair business practice. We were hacked. We're the victim. Why are you coming after us? And the FTC said, because you did nothing. And the failure to take steps to protect customer data after you knew there was a problem, that's an unfair business practice. Customers have the right to expect that you will take reasonable steps to protect their information. It got appealed to the Third Circuit, and the Third Circuit agreed with the FTC. And so now the Commission has, in essence, carte blanche to pursue companies that are not taking adequate steps to protect customer data. Does that mean that you're going to be in litigation with the FTC after a breach, even after a large breach? Not necessarily. Ashley Madison hasn't been brought into litigation with the FTC. Now, they're a Canadian company. That might have something to do with it. But there are many, many businesses that suffer a breach that are not brought to litigation. But if you don't act swiftly in response to a breach, you may be one of them. So data security requires preparation. It requires thinking on the front end about how to deal with potential soft targets and how to deal with potential government investigation or government regulatory action or government litigation after the fact. So how do you do this? We encourage our clients to establish data security programs. We encourage them to keep up to date with FTC guidance, and we will help clients do that. We have a guidebook that we work with them. Phil mentioned this earlier. Directors and officers must treat data security as a high priority. This is one of those times when a simple fig leaf conversation at a board meeting is not going to do. Derivative lawsuits against officers and directors of companies that suffer a data breach have skyrocketed in the last 3 years, and none of them are getting dismissed at the motion to dismiss stage. Courts want to hear just how much these directors and officers were discussing data security, whether they were actually paying attention to what was said in these meetings, whether anything was done as a result of conversations with experts about how to protect the business. So now, the plaintiff's bar is attempting to use derivative actions to force businesses to take more aggressive stances on data security. And from the other side, and that the alphabet soup that Phil mentioned, the SEC is doing the same. SEC guidance is coming out now that says, you need to take data security seriously. It's a compliance issue. We expect and demand, particularly if you are dealing with personal financial information, and we all are, we demand that you take adequate and serious steps to discuss these matters, or else we will issue an enforcement action against you. So from all ends, we're seeing an increase in scrutiny on what Ds and Os are doing to take data security issues seriously. And we've talked a little bit about cyber insurance. That's its entire own webinar. But this last point here is one I want to emphasize. Don't fight the last war. It's easy to be reactive, to say, okay, well, our systems were hacked last time because there was a Trojan or there was a bad password, and so we fired that person, so we're probably good. We've managed the situation. There's a difference between putting out a fire and putting in a fireproof wall. Don't think that just because you've managed or put out a fire, you're not still at risk for further liability in the future. Information security is more than passwords. Talked a little bit about this and what it means to be DataSmart. At the firm, we talk not just about data security, we talk about information management, because it isn't just what you're doing to protect customer data. It's about what are you doing to protect your trade secrets. Have you talked with counsel about the Defend Trade Secrets Act of 2016 and the robust new protections it offers to your information and your data and your trade secrets? Have you looked into the effect that regulations about electronic production of documents in litigation is going to affect you and potentially expose you to sanctions? Have you looked at the way information security, information management intersects with the employment contracts that you draft for your employees and what they can and cannot do, what they can and cannot have access to? It's not just about knowing good passwords. It's about managing all of the information that you have. It's a holistic approach to taking care of your information, which again is your currency. So what does it mean to be DataSmart? It means to consult with informed sources, talk with people who know, and sometimes that means reaching out to the government on the front end and say, what can I do to be stronger and to be better? Everyone waits for the phone call or the letter or the knock on the door from the government. They wait with trepidation, but they wait for it. Sometimes, however, it makes sense to make the phone call first and to say, we're really trying to make some best practices decisions here. What do you think? What's your input? And I guarantee you that that will change the way you think you should proceed, and it will also create an impression in the mind of the government, the people that you're working with, that you care about this, that this is an issue that's important to you. That matters. Develop an information management strategy. Make sure that you know how to control your brand, control your information, control and protect your clients' information. Minimize the known risks. Don't use admin or admin1 or password1 or my favorite 12345. Don't use those passwords, okay? Come for the bagels, stay for the free legal advice. Don't use those passwords. But it's more complicated than that, of course. But figure out the risks that you can take off the table to make yourself not be a soft target for hackers. And then when you know how to upgrade, and you know that the upgrade is going to make sense, when you have different systems that'll work, when you have found a chief information security officer or a chief information officer who really knows their stuff, move ahead. Don't just upgrade because you think it's going to make sense. Anybody who's downloaded the most recent iPhone operating software, you realize all my pictures are gone. I don't know what to do. Okay? Make sure that you know what you're doing before you do it. And one last piece on perspective. If you want to have an idea of how you should look at what it means to have control over your information and your information systems, unsurprisingly, I love gadgets. So we bought the Alexa, the Amazon personal talking assistant. You can ask Alexa to play music. Great. So I'm working in the house, I'm putting some things away, and I have to tell Alexa that I want to listen to some Led Zeppelin. Great. Over the Hills and Far Away comes on. Super. I'm working, I go outside to the car, I come back, and Mickey Mouse is playing. There's a Mickey Mouse song. Go back to Led Zeppelin. Go back out, come back in, Mickey Mouse again. This happens 3 times until I catch my 3-year-old daughter telling Alexa that she wants to listen to Mickey Mouse. And I say, no thanks, it's time for Led Zeppelin. And then it occurs to me that I had an insecure system that someone gained access to use my property for their gain. Now, she'd dispute whether it was my property or hers, and admittedly, it's the most adorable data breach ever, but you have to remember that there's a wide range of opportunities for people to come in and take advantage of your soft targets. Don't leave too many of them out there.
Thanks very much to everybody for their remarks. Let me kick off the Q&A if I could, and I'd really be interested in hearing on this from each of you, from your different perspectives that you represent. We've talked a lot about just identifying the lay of the land, understanding the issues. We've talked about, and appropriately so, proactive measures that can be taken. But let's turn things around for just a second. If we were to assume the worst case scenario, there's been a cyber attack, we need now to react to it in the most appropriate way. What basic steps should companies be taking, again, from each of your perspectives, in the event of that worst case scenario?
I can start on my side. Well, I think the first thing you have to do is have an incident response plan. So if you have one, then take it out, and hopefully you tested or are familiar with it in the past 6 months. If not, then you're going to be struggling. That's the first thing you want to do.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines that if you're thinking how I should react, it's too late. You can't react. It has to be set up in advance, and usually in a little more detail. The plan has to, I think, have two major components that work simultaneously. One is to know for the type of breach or incident who the people are that will be contacted with backups, all contact information, and being able to get them on real time immediately until it is done. And then, part of that, I should say it's not really separate, is you have to do an immediate root cause analysis. And there's a lot of good literature on root cause analysis, because what a lot of people do, and this goes to, putting out the fire, not building the firewall, they will get down 2 levels and go, this was the immediate cause of the incident, and this is what caused that immediate cause of the incident, and they stop. You have to keep asking what caused that. I call it the 5 whys, WHY, 5 whys, until you get to the one where there's no more, until you get to the actual root cause, and that's what you have to address, either to solve the problem immediately or to make sure the same kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Right. Not to start sounding like we're in an echo chamber, but both Mark and George are right. I mean, having the plan ahead of time is crucial, and having that plan include knowing who's going to be in charge of what. You need to know who is going to be at the table for you from both a technical perspective, a legal perspective, and a business corporate perspective. Who's going to be in the room and who's going to be making the decisions. And secondly, who are you going to contact? What are the outside resources that you already have lined up to either do the kind of forensic analysis so you can figure out what was the root cause? Because it's not just important, obviously, for, okay, how can we fix it next time? You need to know, what system do we still have compromised? What machines do we have to take offline because we can no longer use them? When do we have to go to a backup system rather than continuing to use something that's already been compromised, it's just going to make it worse. And also from our selfish perspective, who are now the people in law enforcement that we have to contact? And that's, again, why I kind of left some contact information for you there, so that you already have in your head not only what lawyers am I contacting, what computer forensics people am I contacting, but also who in law enforcement am I contacting. Having that all ahead of time is important to know. The other thing to know, I think, ahead of time as part of the planning stage is you have to think about what are the crown jewels of my company? What is the thing that I absolutely cannot afford to lose? There's so many different vectors out there of what is going to different targets that can be attacked. It's very difficult to cover everything. So you really have to do a lot of thinking of what is the worst case scenario? What do I have to protect at all costs? And think about how that data can either be segregated, you can ensure that it's backed up, so that you know what your priority is in terms of what to protect.
I would just add, and what I think Jared was getting, that's what enterprise risk management truly is. If you have a good enterprise risk matrix, it lists all of your prime business objectives, the risks that need to be identified that if they end up in bad results will prevent you or limit you reaching your objectives. And then for each one, weighting those risks, coming up with the triggers and tolerance levels of what those risks are so you understand where you are. And then having a breach log behind each risk. And this takes a lot of training in the organization. A breach log and the risk where if each risk that you've identified on the matrix gets breached because it's gone beyond a tolerance level, doing the root cause analysis for the breach. And since your tolerance levels for your risk matrix are going to be always lower than a disaster, right, because disaster is never an acceptable threshold level, you do a much better job at being preventative because once you have a reasonable threshold that's crossed, you do the root cause analysis and you fix it. And more times than not, that's going to mean you won't have the worst circumstance that could occur for the same type of breach, just in a different context or size.
I'm sure you'll be surprised to hear me say this, but you should probably lawyer up right away. And the reason I say that is because there is a Byzantine series of regulatory and compliance steps that you need to follow. In the state of Florida, for example, if your breach affects more than 500 people, you have to notify the Secretary of State within 48 hours and everyone affected by the breach. And understanding how to handle, and most states have requirements that are very similar. So if you don't have someone who understands the complexities of these laws and these regulations for how to deal with them, and that doesn't say anything about the privacy laws that we discussed earlier and the potential impact that those have for a breach, you need to have someone advising you about what to do. So I absolutely agree that there is no substitute for a good plan. And the plan needs to be with all parties, all relevant, all interested parties involved. Sometimes people talk about data security and information management as though it's an IT issue. It's not an IT issue. IT is a component of it and an important one, but just because there's technology involved doesn't mean that this is relegated to the ones and zeros of your IT team. So have everyone involved. Have your compliance officers, your counsel inside and outside, your CEO, your entire C-suite involved in crafting a plan about how to respond in the first hour, in the first day, and in the first week, because there's differences between what you'll do at the triage, management, and retrospective stages. So all of those aspects of managing and responding to a risk are mitigated and made easier by having a plan in place. But it requires a lot of input and a lot of participation from across the teams.
A quick follow-up to you, Jared, from your presentation. On one of the last slides that you showed us, you mentioned resources that were available to companies and presumably the public from the government. Can you expand on that a little bit, characterize for us what kinds of shared intelligence are available to companies from the government and how they can go about getting that?
Well, actually, part of this is the intelligence is coming not really from the government, but it's coming from the private sector. And there are a number of organizations that have sprung up to allow private sector to be sharing information about what they're seeing or what you're seeing on your own networks. One is there are a series of organizations known as ISACs, Information Sharing, and of course now I can't remember the whole acronym, but they're industry specific. So there's one for financial services, there's one for critical infrastructure. There are separate ones for a range of different industries. Where you can get together with other members of your industry and understand what you're seeing, what attacks have been occurring, what are the best defenses against it. So the ISACs are one key resource. Another, there's a public-private partnership between the FBI and other law enforcement and the private sector that's based in Pittsburgh, the National Cyber Forensic Training Alliance. Again, great resource, and again, this is on that handout that I mentioned before. Really good resource for, especially for the financial sector, that builds intelligence reports on what breaches have been occurring, how they've been occurring, so that you can look for the trend and you can sort of anticipate what might be coming down the road. The Department of Homeland Security also maintains a clearinghouse of cyber intelligence. Again, the exact website is on is on that handout. But that again tries to gather information from the private sector, so that when a breach occurs, that's reported. Others can know what to watch out for, what the signatures of the malware are, what the vulnerabilities in the particular software is, so you know what you have to patch and what you have to look out for.
Thank you very much. Let me invite questions from the audience, and one note before we get to the questions. We're also recording this as a webinar. Some people aren't able to attend, or maybe some people will want to hear some of these things again. In either scenario, you can access this via webinar. So I'm going to ask the panelists, when they hear a question to which they're responding, if you don't mind, please repeat the question, just so we have that available to the audience tuning in for the webinar. Questions?
This is, I think, I'll take anybody's reaction. Do you envision like an Interpol type of evolution in terms of the international effort to coordinate in terms of these issues and these risks?
There's certainly. Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Thank you for the reminder. The question was whether I envision, I guess, an evolution in Interpol to sort of coordinate an international response to cybercrime. I think you definitely hit on really the hardest issue, or one of the hardest issues in terms of prosecution in this area, is that these type of crimes transcend borders in a way that makes it difficult to investigate, difficult to apprehend. I wouldn't necessarily say that I see Interpol sort of evolving into, I guess, an overarching investigator of such crimes, but there is increasingly more and more international cooperation, particularly between the EU and the United States, in both sharing resources, coordinating investigations, and trying to speed up the process by which we can get evidence in different jurisdictions. So in some ways, that evolution has started. Quite candidly, to have a truly global, overarching entity, I think, would be as difficult as any kind of international agreement would be. But I think there is at least the recognition that there are that this is an international problem and can only be solved through international partnerships, and we certainly have taken steps towards building those. Please.
Hi, I'm with Kaufman Rothman. We provide consulting services to financial service companies. And we're seeing more and more of our clients having an appetite for cybersecurity insurance, and not just from a litigation exposure standpoint, but also from an incident response standpoint, where some of the insurance company will assist financial service companies be a one-stop shop for an incident, meaning they're going to set up a call center for the client to call, they're going to contact the various states depending on the breach, and also assign Jake Ward to be the attorney to kind of go through this process. I'd like to have your thoughts on the private side, whether you have cybersecurity insurance, you're considering it, and law enforcement, and also from yourself, James, see if that's something that you talk to your clients about.
So I guess the question was, is cybersecurity insurance worth it? I'm looking at someone who works with me. Do we have cyber insurance? I'm not sure that we do.
We are actually looking to get into cybersecurity insurance, so we're definitely looking at that. That's something that is in the works. And actually through discussion with Kaufman as well and other vendors, that's something I would suggest to get, and I think it's also helpful in the incident response plan as well, and helping formulate that. So yeah, that's something that we're looking to get in the very near future.
Okay, so apparently my company is looking to get it, but that also means for the last 20 years we haven't had it. And I can say we haven't had any negative consequences of not having it. I don't know how much it's improved. There used to be a time when if you got brokerage insurance or D&O liability insurance, you know, if you were lucky and your claim was within the four corners of the policy, you had a 50% chance of recovering. And things have evolved. Certainly in D&O liability, it's become a lot better, and brokerage and online brokerage liability. But my general experience is insurance covers a small fraction of what you need to care about. So the main takeaway from this is don't look at insurance as a cure of a substantial part, any substantial part of the problem, because it'll be very small if you're lucky for the type of incident that happens that it is covered. And then you're going to have also, I'm sure, very large deductibles and limits, and it's not going to be cheap.
Yeah, perhaps for those reasons, I would just add that one of the most interesting new waves of litigation we're seeing within the data security and privacy area is almost precisely what Mark was talking about. Maybe because people don't want to explore the possibility of getting new, more specifically focused insurance policies, specifically focused on cyber liability, there are bitter fights about whether existing policies like D&O policies can be read to cover cyber liability issues. Very important question. Thanks for asking that. More questions? Well, go ahead.
On the topic of cyber insurance, is there any industry standards that mitigate the cost? So if I comply to this and comply to that, my insurance premium will be lower. It's like your car insurance, if you go to a point, it's bad news, etc. You've got a clean slate and you've done lots of things to protect yourself. I've not come across any standards. I'm looking for those, but it's just interesting in the balance.
No, that's only in the UK where you get that kind of protection sometimes. I don't think there's anything. The question was, are there kind of standards that you would follow that would give you a safe harbor where you wouldn't need insurance, where you could use that as an absolute defense, either, I guess, for government regulators or third-party complaints? And I am familiar with standards like that do exist in certain contexts in Europe, but I know of nothing in the United States, and I haven't brought anyone else. We're much more litigious, and everything is an individual case, so it's very difficult in this context to have any standard that would give you immunity the same way insurance would be a guarantee if it was paid and performed.
And no matter what you did as far as securing your assets, etc., and the compliance you went with, your premium is going to be the same.
You mean your premiums for your insurance? Well, I'm guessing it's like any other insurance, that if you have a history of bad claims, your premiums will certainly go up.
That's what are the standards?
Oh, you mean for the premiums you pay?
Yeah.
Maybe someone else can answer that better. Generally, if you have a clean record, and depending on your type of business and how they measure the risks of your type of business, they're going to assess your premium, and then the other part is going to be history of claims. So first they'll assess you as low risk or high risk, depending on the type of business you do. If you're handling other people's money like a bank, you're going to be very high risk. If you're just delivering to people $5 items, that's a different kind of risk, and your premiums, I'm sure, will reflect that. And then your claim history also will be the other major component. But I think it's like any other insurance. I don't think there's anything special about it.
Yeah. So, based on my experience, like maybe 5 or 6 years ago, if someone was doing cybersecurity insurance, and pretty much everyone was getting cybersecurity insurance policies very easily. And I've seen the shift in the market now. A lot of times our clients are coming saying, like, okay, I need to get a quote on a cybersecurity insurance policy, and they're asking me for an information security program that needs to be documented, including incident response policy. So they're shifting to say, like, listen, I'm not going to give you a quote or even think about insuring you if you don't have these 10 things in place before. So I think they're getting better at making sure that at least you're following some type of procedures. You have some documented information security program. When you look at the applications, they're asking you if you have an information security officer, do you have tested your information security program. So I think they're getting better at it, but I don't know that it is so clear saying, like, okay, if you have all of these things, your premium will lower.
A couple quick responses to your question. I think in some respects, although cyber insurance has been around for some years, it's still a relatively nascent tool to protect yourself from cyber risk. And I think as insurance companies become more sophisticated about how to carve out the policy and to, establish the parameters of what they will and won't cover, that's going to change. I mean, there is no industry standard right now when it comes to data security. And that leads me to an important point. In some of the lawsuits that have been brought based on a data breach in the last 5 to 7 years, you see the sort of standard negligence claims asserted. you knew that there was a possibility that there would be a data breach, you ignored the risk and you allowed, for example, my credit card information to be stored on site for 48 hours, and then it was hacked, and you caused me damages. But some of these cases, which have survived motions to dismiss, are now asserting that the reason why the claim should proceed is because even though there was an acceptable minimum standard, that you didn't comply with the state of the art, that's where the error that was made by the hacked company was. So it's shifting from the standard negligence theory to the sort of enterprise liability, strict liability standard of, are you keeping up with generally accepted practices? And if that becomes the norm, we're going to see a huge change in the way that data security cases proceed. Because in a negligence case, the issue is really about whether or not the plaintiff, the individual customer, for example, whose information was stolen, can prove that you knew of or ignored a substantial risk in formulating your policy for response. If it shifts to this strict or enterprise liability standard, then it's going to be, what are you, company, doing to maintain sort of an adequate level of defense for your industry? So the burden at the preliminary stage shifts to you. So as that pans out in the next couple of years, because if you want to talk about early days, litigation over data breaches is very early. We're watching the emergence of a new tort. And so we don't know yet where it's going to go. We'll have to keep a very close eye on that. And the only other brief thing that I want to mention, I think Mark mentioned the word safe harbor, and I can tell you from the UK. So the EU's regulations regarding the storage of EU citizen data in the United States, which is the safe harbor that was curiously tossed out by the European Court of Justice just months before the Department of Commerce was due to negotiate a new safe harbor deal. That's still in flux. So they have something now that they're calling Privacy Shield, which is a terrible name, that's going to govern how data that's housed in the United States for EU citizens is managed and what the oversight of it is. But in the next 3 to 5 years, we'll probably see some more back and forth between the U.S. and the EU about who, how, and when EU citizen data can be stored in this country, and that's another potential source of liability because you will be hailed into court in the EU if you breach those regulations.
Go ahead.
Along those lines, we're a small international education business. Been on about 25 years. We've been expanding into managing student information, those kind of things, obviously in our databases, and have just come up against this issue in the EU of, they don't want us, our partners in Europe don't want their information being stored in our data securities. Because we're small, we have a CTO, but we don't really have anything beyond that, and that's why we came here today. But is this something that can be outsourced rather than just trying to hire somebody that's going to come in and do that? Are there services that help us sort of develop our security plan at the next level of compliance? How are other people doing it that are, under $5-6 million a year companies without having to bring on a full security team?
So I can tell you based on my experience, we have a couple of clients that are in a similar situation, used to comply with the EU, and now they're like up there. Part of the issue is that the standard has not been fully documented or identified. I think one recommendation will be if you can actually host your data directly in the EU, you can get a cloud provider. It creates a little bit of inefficiency from a technology perspective, but it will make your life easier. Or if you want to keep everything in-house, I think you're going to have to implement the data security plan program with the policies that will help you comply with the rules, which is nothing different from what you should already be doing. It's just the documentation that you're doing it. That's my experience.
Yeah, and just to answer or to address your question about what do you do when you're small about satisfying third parties,
have the same exposure. So it's like
that's a tough one. I mean,
tens of thousands of data.
I mean, TradeStation's been around for a long time, and just recently we got to the point where we have an independent chief risk officer, an independent head of internal audit, independent, chief compliance officers we've always had. But I think the answer is you have to think a little bit, if you're planning to grow, about maybe more money than before as just, as important a business goal and resource as anything. And the truth is, in the end, it'll give you more efficient operations anyway, and it'll save you money for things you find out about after the fact. So I think in the end, it actually is good if you get the right people. But the main answer is when you're smaller, you have to use external sources. But if you can get one good person there who knows what they're doing, you're willing to pay them, they can coordinate, they can pick the right consultants and for what, and they can also, very importantly, see what's going on in your company from the inside and present the issues to those outside consultants. Because the last thing you want to do is waste money with outside consultants, just say, come in and look around. It's very wasteful, and 9 times out of 10, they don't even find anything, which is, I've experienced that a lot, which is a little nerve-wracking, because you know there are things there. So a good person on the inside, at least one good person to start at your size, and who can really focus on the issues, present them to the people who can really kick it and do gap analysis and make you better and satisfy the third parties who's saying, what are you doing about this?
We're winding up. Let me ask one quick last question, and maybe, Jared, this is something you can comment on. We're talking a lot about, or maybe thinking a lot about these issues from a prism of somebody trying to hack into company systems to get access to Social Security numbers, credit card numbers, other personally identifiable information. How much, if you can comment on this, do you think companies need to be worried about, from what you're seeing, more competitively motivated hacks, economic espionage, trying to get access to trade secrets?
That's a good question. I think there's certainly what we're concerned about is usually the international economic espionage, and not to name names, but I think the perceived threat from China, most of all, of attempting to exfiltrate trade secrets out of the country is a threat that I think a lot of companies are very sensitive to, and is a very real threat, and something that Jay mentioned before, some updates to the economic espionage trade secret laws to try to protect against. That certainly is a challenge. In terms of, I think what you're asking is in more the domestic realm of, a little bit more, I hesitate to say, ordinary company-on-company economic espionage. And I think, as a department, I think we have seen some incidents of that. I think more often than not, it comes out of the employee that's moving from one place to another and taking resources with him, less than, say, competitor hires hacker to, sort of make an external attack on the system. That's just my impression. I don't know that for certain. One thing that makes, the department certainly is trying to handle economic espionage issues, and as I talked a little bit about before, we're trying to have increasing tools in our toolbox to address the international problems. The Obama administration actually made this a source of a priority to address with China, and we've actually have seen some movement in that, where the Chinese are starting, I think, to take a little more seriously the need to prevent actors in their country from attacking our companies. And so we have seen a little bit of movement with that, with indictments that we've brought against Chinese individuals, with the potential for sanctions on foreign companies that engage in economic espionage. So there are some tools that we're trying to bring to bear there.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for your time, and thanks to all of you for your attention.